Good morning. My name is David. I am one of the pastors here on staff, and there's Katie. Yeah, I don't compost, whittle guitars, nor do I have any tattoos. That last one, I've always been worried I'd be mistaken for a NASCAR fan. Which is, if you are a NASCAR fan, you are very welcome here. So do know that. Kind of excited. For some time now, it's been multiple years. My fellow staff are going to be chuckling at this. I have been lobbying, campaigning perhaps, for what to call the Christmas series. This is great. This isn't what I've been lobbying for. This is great, though. What I wanted to call it, all right, are you ready for this? Joy to the end of the world. But the end part would be like in parentheses, so it's like clever. And the reason maybe we haven't done it is because like the world has been bad. And maybe it would have felt a little too on the nose. The debate internally, and it's a little one-sided. By that I mean it's me and then literally everyone else on staff against me, has been, well, David, people get to the Christmas season and they don't want to dwell on dark things. They want to be hopeful and positive and sing joy to the world, not joy to the end of the world. And what I have tried in vain to convince them of is that no, this is hopeful. The end of the world is good news. And they told me, they said, fine, we're not going to call the whole series that, but you can kick it off and you can make your case. And in worst case scenario, Sean and Cedric will come in afterwards and make everyone forget about your dark and twisty series idea. So here we are. Buckle up. Because I do think Christmas is hopeful, but it's also for many people not so much. There are many of us, and sometimes it's not a stark either or, it's sort of a both and, many of us who experience the season as kind of a messy mix between maybe a nostalgic remembrance of past seasons that were really positive, a sort of forward-thinking future hope about, where the world is going. New Year's follows quickly after, and for many it's a fresh start, the opportunity to imagine new things that are better. And then for many of us as well, again, sometimes same person, maybe those memories aren't as positive. Maybe it's a reminder of people we've lost, relationships we've lost, circumstances we've lost, things in the past, or maybe the present isn't so great. And we look around to other people who, at least on their Instagram accounts, appear to be having a jolly time, and then we think, oh, that hurts because I'm not. So no, this isn't the title I came up with, but I think it does capture a little bit of what I want to start with, which is there is a bit of a juxtaposition, a tension, a both and between what many of us experience in this season. And there's a longing, certainly, for hopefulness. There's a longing for joy, genuine joy. But there's fear. There's pain. There's a sense of, I don't know, that feeling when maybe it has been a positive season for you and it's all kind of been building up to Christmas Day, and then it's great and it's fine, and maybe it doesn't quite meet your expectations, but all in all it's a good time. And then that next day, Boxing Day, to my Canadian friends, the 26th is kind of like, oh, well, now I guess it's over. And there's this melancholy, this sort of letdown. So even in the best case scenario where the season is positive and joyous, inevitably, sometimes some sense of disappointment or melancholy kind of comes on the tail end. And so it's messy. It's a messy season. We try to gloss over it with I don't know, tinsel and stuff, but it's messy. And so I want to interrogate a little bit my little idea here, Joey to the end of the world, and I kind of want to do it in reverse order. I want to start with that last word, world, and then work my way backwards through end up until joy. And I think maybe, if I don't at least convince myself that this is still an idea worth contending for, maybe some of you will be along for the ride with me. So first off, world. World feels really heavy right now because, well, that's our world. Every day, you get on the news and there are new Greek letters that many of us don't know how to pronounce or have never heard before. What is it called? Omicron? Sounds like a Transformer. Like a Decepticon. Like Megatron, he's bringing out Omicron, and now Optimus Prime is finally going to get defeated. Yeah. I don't like NASCAR, but I do like some kind of cars. Especially when they can turn into giant robots and fight. Anyway, that's a tangent. So coronavirus. It's been weighing on us for almost 2 years now. Climate change, it's really warm out there. It's nice, but I don't know. There's fires everywhere. I'm the youth pastor sometimes. And, I spend time with the youth, and man, they have all of this anxiety about a world that's burning and melting, about the debt that they know they're going to accrue in order to have jobs, about school shootings, again, things like that. The world feels heavy. It feels heavy. And so in that sense, would it really be the worst thing for it to end? But here's the reality. When I say end, and so now I'm going to talk about end and world at the same time. There's a couple different ways of conceiving world. Like, yes, we have the world, the earth, the globe, and on some level we share it, and we all have to experience on that. But then world can also be a more personal term. It can name our direct experience, our relationships, our vocation, our context, and things like that. Sometimes our family unit or our friend unit constitutes a kind of world for us. If you spend any amount of time here at Watershed, you will hear us talk about justice through the lens of systems, these things that we kind of create both consciously and unconsciously that uphold just our expectations about how the world should work. And many of these end up being exploitive or oppressive. And so that constitutes a kind of world. And then at a very personal existential level, we have nothing beyond just our experience of the world. And our experience might be different from someone else's experience. And there's a sense in which we need to sort of hold that intention. But for us, that is our world. And so when we kind of hop over to this other word, end, then there's lots of senses in which the world could potentially end. Yes, sure, the heat death of the universe some billions of years from now as everything kind of contracts or the sun explodes. I don't know. I like sci-fi, so sometimes I get these ideas. That sort of end, which none of us will be around to experience anyway, would be rather dismal, or maybe great because it will happen really quickly, and that would be that. But there are other notions of end. The end of a season. In our lives, that the end of a relationship, the end of a job situation, a vocational situation, the end of living in a certain place and moving to a different place, the end of a certain era systemically, within our culture, as things shift, as we begin to come awake to new opportunities, new realities. There are lots of ways for us to conceive of the world, and certainly there are lots of ways for us to then conceive of the end of that world. And crucially, and depending on kind of how you're experiencing your world right now, when I talked about some of those things ending, some of your minds probably went to very positive things, and some of your minds probably went to very negative things. Sometimes the end of a relationship is the most importantly hopeful thing that you can experience. Sometimes the end of a job is very hopeful. Getting out of something, less great to move on to something more, more aligned with, your gifts, your aspirations, your talents, things like that. it's contextual, and sometimes it's both. We like to make these kind of either or, kind of really sharp contrasts, but sometimes it's a little of both. Sometimes both. The end is both good and bad. It's full of hope and it's full of fear, and that, of course, then brings us to joy. We've talked about joy in this space over the years, and very frequently are trying to contrast it a little bit from happiness. Happiness is this circumstantial thing that you experience from time to time. It's often bound to a particular event, a particular context. It's fleeting, it's pleasurable, but it's largely all good. It's just a moment of pleasure. Sometimes it's sustainable, if those circumstances can be repeated, with some consistency, but it's rarely something that we can truly grasp, and we pursue it, certainly, because it makes us feel good. Joy is messier. Joy almost takes for granted a kind of loss. It's a nevertheless, and even so, in the face of something hard, something real, something painful perhaps. And joy is defiant in that sense. It's a sort of a defiant bursting forth of not merely happiness, something more fundamental, something more visceral than mere happiness. Joy, it's a yes and a no in the face of what has happened, but it doesn't deny, it doesn't run from, it doesn't disavow that yes, that did happen, whatever that may be. It doesn't retreat from that. It doesn't go around that. Joy goes through. And so that really, more than anything, is kind of what I wanted to get at when I think of this idea of joy to the end of the world, because as we've reversed order and we kind of go back through, it's joy taking the both and of that end, whatever that end is, that end that is, closing one season of our life and bringing on a new season of our life, inaugurating for us and ending for us a certain way of being in the world. Joy is not a stark either-or between the possible hopefulness of that experience and the fear that it might bring about. Joy is a both-and. It's a nevertheless. It says, even so, I'm going to push forward. And in many ways, I think this is the experience of some of the key characters in the Christmas narrative: Mary, Joseph, Jesus himself. When Mary was first quite frankly, imposed upon by God to bear the Christ child, that did constitute a kind of end of the world for her, end of her world, a certain way of being in the world. Expectations around, what her world was going to look like inevitably were going to change. Her reputation was inevitably going to change, that's for sure. Same, of course, was true for Joseph. There was certainly an anticipation and excitement to all of this, but a trepidation, unfair assumptions, cultural associations, the implications of her being not yet wed, betrothed to Joseph, and for those of us familiar with the Advent narrative, both in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke, you get different sort of accounts of this, but there is a sense in which it wasn't a stark either-or between a budding excitement and a fearful trepidation as it relates to this end of the world. And then for Jesus himself, as we sort of take a step back and kind of look at the bigger picture of the Christ narrative and this idea that on some level, the book of Philippians tells us that, the person of Christ didn't consider this godhood something to be grasped or held onto, but humbled himself, took on the form of a human, a form of a servant, even unto death. There is this juxtaposition, this joyful tension, both hope and fear in all of this. You've probably heard, not from its original source, the philosopher Seneca, more likely you've heard it from the one-hit wonder band Semisonic, but every new beginning is always some other beginning's end. Closing time. So, yeah, they didn't write that line. They stole it from a dead Stoic. Anyway, but yeah, something was ending for Mary. Something was ending for Joseph, and in a very real sense, something was ending for Jesus, ending for God, and yet something new was budding, was being born from this. I wish I could tell you that there was some sort of formula, some sort of solution that would bring about a wholly hopeful, a wholly happy, a wholly warmth and wholly fulfilling formula for the Christmas season. Really, that word whole is interesting here. Whole with a W, which is almost the exact opposite of whole with just the H, But the reality is it's a tension between those two. There are these things that we can pursue, that we can rub shoulders with, that we can experience, that make us get a fleeting glimpse of the whole with the W. And yet for many of us, perhaps for all of us, if we're being completely honest, there is still a whole without the W. You can almost imagine it W/HOLE, and that slash, that cut, exists in kind of the tension between those two experiences. But the case that I want to make to you this morning is that cut is perhaps the most hopeful thing of all, because it's the cut that makes the new thing possible. The advent of Christ, in many ways, was a cut. It was a cut that upended a certain way of being in the world, not just for Mary, not just for Joseph, not just for however we imagine or understand the being of God, but at a more global world level. For both good and, for being completely honest, bad. The advent of Christ, the Christ event, the death, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and the subsequent movement kind of born out of that experience has, and again, for good and bad, changed the world. At the more immediate level, in the lives of Christ's disciples, that cut pulled them, jarred them out of certain expectations. And in fact, not only did it suck them out of certain expectations that they had about the way that the world was going in their context under Roman oppression, Roman occupation, in their relative squalor and poverty as poor fishermen and some of them with other vocations and things like that. But even then, their expectations about who Jesus was going to be and how he was going to be the Messiah, be the Savior, was then cut, ruptured, interrupted, upended in the experience of Christ's death on the cross. So in the entire narrative, the entire experience of Jesus, from both Advent all the way through the Easter narrative, there is this cut that doesn't really allow us to get comfortable on either end of the hope and fear spectrum. It's not a binary where we're kind of trying to land on where the emphasis needs to lie. And it's certainly not something that needs to exist in a kind of balance. The proper word for it would be more dialectical. It's a unresolvable contradiction. It's a kind of paradox. But it's this contradiction, this paradox at the heart of the entire New Testament narrative, the entire story around Jesus, that I want to suggest is the very thing that animates our hope. Recently, we, and by we I mean myself and a handful of others, finished the very first iteration of a new block experience here at Watershed. It was called Liberation. And for those of you who've been around for a long time, you might know that, at Watershed we have these different pathways. They're values. They're these three sort of ideas that we think imperfectly sort of animate and explain our community. The first one is reclamation, this idea that we are orienting ourselves, trying to find ourselves in a long tradition of experiences with God and working out the best ways to put language to that experience, to define and describe our encounter with God in ways that are simultaneously conversant in conversation with those who came before us, perhaps especially within the Christian tradition, but not exclusively, certainly not exclusively, while at the same time learning to speak of God in ways and means that are appropriate and intelligible to our context. Because sometimes the context that we are in dialogue with wouldn't translate directly to ours, so that there is this translation process, this give and this take, and that's what reclamation is. And Preface engages in that a little bit. We're certainly doing that a little bit on Sunday mornings, and then we have a specific block experience, shameless plug, I lead it, where we engage this idea of reclamation. And then the second one is this idea of transformation, this idea that at no point do we ever arrive, any notion of being, any notion of self, any notion of who we are is always in the process of a becoming. And again, it's a both and thing. We both are always in process, in progress, becoming who we are, but sometimes that becoming is a coming awake. It's not just an evolution, it's not just a transformation, but it's a coming awake, a coming to accept, which is a grace-filled practice, a grace-filled experience. It's a coming to accept who we always already were. And sometimes that acceptance, that grace, not that we necessarily need to receive from others, but that we receive and give to ourselves, is the most crucial point of that transformation. Katie talked about this a moment ago. I really resonated with everything she said about the imposter syndrome. Because I think most of us probably all have our own version of that. I know I certainly do. And so part of this transformation, this becoming process, is just learning to accept that you're accepted. Sometimes accepting yourself is step one, So we have reclamation, we have transformation, then we have liberation. Liberation is this messy process of emancipation, of freedom, of both on an interpersonal, relational level, but at a more cultural, societal, systemic level, getting free, freeing others. It is a violent process at times. We talked about that in this liberation block experience that I'm talking about. It's messy. It's not formulaic. We long for formulas because they do create a sense of wholeness. They sort of paper over the contradictions of our life. And that's not intended to be a dig at math, which I'm bad at. There is certainly a place for math. I wish I was better at it. But there is something more art than science about the liberation process. It's not going to resolve itself comfortably or easily. And there was a piece, an article that we engaged in this liberation block experience that just wrapped up this last week by Rev Lynice Pinkard, who's a minister, an organizer, and activist out in the Bay Area in California. It's called Revolutionary Suicide. Okay, and this idea drawn from the work of Huey Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panthers, not initially engaged in his time, probably because of the implications of it were so daunting for people, but really engaged nicely in this PDF that we sort of circulated in the block. And if anyone is interested, you can email me afterwards, and I'd be happy to forward it along with you to you. But it's just this dense piece that we wrestled with, and this idea of revolutionary suicide, I think, gets at the tension, the hopeful tension that I'm wanting to name here, because what Reverend Pinkard talks about is this need on some level to die. To die to a certain way of being in the world, and that's experienced traumatically at times for people, especially when it's taken on intentionally, it's taken on willingly, dying to certain things that we cling to, systems, perhaps, ways of organizing and ordering our society, our relationships that maybe give us a sense of familiarity, a sense of safety, a sense of privilege, but necessarily, in order to assure that, marginalize or exploit others who look, live, or love differently than us. So there is something unsettling, something rupturing about being willing to die to those systems. And then at a more personal level, there's also a need to sometimes die to other things that we are maybe personally clinging to feel safe and secure in the world. This can be a relationship that is perhaps harmful to us, but the sense of familiarity or proximity to it keeps us there. It could be a job or a vocation. It could be a family dynamic. It could be some other thing that we cling to or lean into in order to build a kind of identity that is at least stable for us. And so this idea of revolutionary suicide is not, it's meant to be jarring. It's a jarring notion. It's a traumatic notion. It's a triggering notion. And forgive me if invoking it is scratching at or clawing at a personal traumatic experience of your own. But this idea of dying to a certain way of being in the world, especially if you find yourself complicit, consciously or unconsciously, occupying a place in the system that benefits from the exploitation or the marginalization of others. So there is something terrifying about that, but then liberating about that. Because once we are, and here's my contention, once we are free of some of these things that we cling to, some of these things that we use to save ourselves, or at least to convince ourselves that we're being saved, once we are free of these things, we're finally free for genuine solidarity. We are free, finally, to be with and for one another. But sometimes letting go of those things that form a buffer between us and those who are different from us is scary. Now, a few weeks ago, yes, band, this is your cue. Now, a few weeks ago, I kicked off our last series, Loose Blocks, talking about baptism, and I looked at the passage in John chapter 3 where Jesus and Nicodemus are talking, and I sort of dove into it, and then I had another idea in the moment, and I chased that one, and I never really landed that plane. Hopefully the message was coherent, but I realized as I was driving home, I was like, oh yeah, I never really, buttoned that all up. So sort of to bring it back around both this morning and to anyone who is here for that, if not, don't worry about it. I kind of want to end back in John 3, not what most people think of as like a Christmas or an Advent passage in the Bible, but one that I think is deeply relevant. You see, because Nicodemus, the religious leader at the time, is wrestling with this, the teachings of Jesus and trying to make sense of them, trying to understand what Jesus is trying to call for, what Jesus is trying to nudge the people of Israel towards in this season. The people of Israel, of course, expecting this messianic figure who they think is going to come and kind of lead this like military revolution that's going to kick out the Romans, and then once they kind of re-establish themselves as sort of the seat of power in Jerusalem, then would maybe extend further than that, and perhaps the people of Israel would then become sort of the new world power, if not in the world, at least in the region. They are wanting a kind of end of the world, an end of the Roman world, and an inauguration of God's new world, or at least their vision of God's new world. And so Nicodemus is wrestling with this, and what Jesus says to him in response is not what he anticipated, not what he had in mind. Jesus says, "Very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God." Remember, Nicodemus had this very militaristic, literal notion of a kingdom. No one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. Nicodemus protests, "How can someone be born when they are old? Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born." And then it's the second part of this passage that I think really hammers it home. Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they are born of water and the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying, you must be born again." And then here's the key part. This is where I sort of lost the thread and never came back to it. "The wind blows where it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit." The wind is free. It's unpredictable. It's not bound by the expectations of a particular system, of a particular structure, of a particular way of being in the world, of an identity that it clings to in order to justify its own existence. No, the wind goes where it pleases. The wind can be with and for whatever it wishes, is Jesus' point. To be born again in Nicodemus' context is to die to what he was clinging to, this certain cultural, religious expectation of what salvation was going to look like, which involved simply reordering the hierarchy, but not getting rid of hierarchy as such. To be born again is to die to a particular narrative, a particular expectation, a particular hope that Nicodemus and many of his fellow Jewish adherents had about what was going to bring wholeness, the W version. And so what Jesus was suggesting was scary, terrifying, traumatic. But then Jesus was tying it to a certain kind of freedom, to being born not of flesh, what Nicodemus was clinging to secure his identity, but a kind of freedom, the opportunity for a certain kind of solidarity that would be scary, yes, but also hopeful. And it's that juxtaposition, I think, between hope, between fear, between loss, but that defiantly says, even so. That's the wellspring of joy. And so in many ways, what Jesus was in fact saying to Nicodemus was that you can find joy. We, as a people, not just a Jewish people, we, as a humanity, can indeed find joy, but only on the other end of the world. It requires a sort of revolutionary suicide. But again, dialectically, tarrying with that kind of contradiction. Something I think Jesus might say is that another way of conceiving of, another way of naming, putting into praxis this idea of revolutionary suicide would be being born again. And so the Advent season is a both and. It's an end. Quite practically, it's the end of our calendar year. It's an end of, for many of us, it can be an end of a certain narrative that we've been telling that, things are great, when in fact maybe they're not. It's an opportunity then. It's an opportunity to end toxic arrangements, things that probably have been tarrying, lingering too long in our lives. Sometimes it's an unsolicited end. Sometimes it's an end that is imposed upon us, and the cut comes both unexpectedly and unwantedly. But that end is always also a new beginning. And so as we lean in to the themes and the promises and the memories and the nostalgias of this season, then may we remember that every end brings about the possibility of a new beginning. Those new beginnings will be scary, almost necessarily so, by definition. But with each new beginning is an opportunity, a sort of freedom. Shedding those things that we lean upon, shedding those things that we cling to in order to save us. True salvation is then found in the radical freedom, the joyful freedom, to be with and to be for one another. So maybe the metaphor of revolutionary suicide lives with you. Maybe it's this notion of being born again. Maybe it's simply the reminder that your fears in this season are valid, but not necessarily mutually exclusive. Your hopes are valid too. Because that's what joy is. And it's a joy that's found not in spite of what might feel like the end of the world to you, but perhaps it's a joy that can live and exist and burst forth from you precisely because it's found at the end of the world. Merry Advent season to you. Merry Christmas to you. It's good to see you. Thanks for being here. Hope to see you back both next week and the week after, but also Christmas Eve. Grace and peace to all of you.